Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the really complex, often messy social illusions surrounding race and identity. And we're going to do this through the brilliant lens of British Ghanaian philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah, alongside the groundbreaking text, The African Philosophy Reader. Let's get right into it. So, what makes you, well, you? It sounds like a pretty simple question, right? But the answer is surprisingly tangled. We constantly label ourselves by our creed, our country, our color, our class, or our culture. In fact, these are the 5 core identities that Appiah deeply examines. But as we'll see today, we really need to pause and investigate just how deep these categories actually go. Are the labels we cling to genuinely serving our shared humanity? To even begin understanding identity, we have to completely dismantle this incredibly pervasive myth called essentialism. Basically, this is the idea that who we are is somehow biologically or culturally hardwired into us right from birth. It's this notion that your behavior or your intellect is strictly determined by whatever group you belong to. Well, Appiah argues forcefully against this. He points out a fascinating fact. Genetic variation within so-called racial groups actually rivals the variation found across all of humanity. Now, Appiah actually takes this dismantling a step further by splitting the whole illusion of race into 2 totally distinct concepts. He draws a really sharp line between racialism, which is just the scientifically false belief that distinct biological races even exist, and racism. Racism takes that completely false belief and, quite literally, weaponizes those fictional identities to systematically oppress other people. Okay, so to really grasp how these super abstract philosophical concepts play out in the real world, it's incredibly helpful to anchor them in Appiah's own extraordinary upbringing. His life doesn't just reflect these ideas, it perfectly embodies the beautiful, complex reality of identity. You see, he hasn't just studied these intersecting lines of culture, he has literally lived them from day one. Think about this journey. He was born in London back in 1954 to an English mother with roots in the British political gentry and a prominent Ghanaian politician father from the Ashanti imperial nobility. He spent his formative years in the 1960s growing up in Kumasi, Ghana, just absorbing Akan traditions, before eventually heading off to the halls of Cambridge for his PhD in 1982, and finally landing as a professor at NYU in 2014. This incredibly rich, lived, hybrid experience completely grounds his entire philosophy. And this specific background perfectly positions Appiah right in the middle of a broader, fiercely contested intellectual space. It's a space that's captured beautifully in the African Philosophy Reader. This is a vital text because it systematically tears down this old, colonial idea of a monolithic, singular African culture. Instead, it presents a rich, multicultural debate on decolonization, identity, and the ongoing struggle for cultural freedoms. Published globally, the crucial push in this text is for an entirely new paradigm. The editors and contributors are championing the idea that cross-cultural cognition absolutely must replace outdated, Eurocentric inventions. Specifically, it goes right after that old, racist notion that Africans possess some sort of pre-logical mentality. It establishes, once and for all, that systems of reasoning are bound by tradition and culture, absolutely not by biological capacity. To dynamically illustrate how that reasoning works, the reader breaks the landscape down into 4 distinct trends originally proposed by Henry Odera Aruka: ethnophilosophy, sage philosophy, ideological nationalistic philosophy, and professional philosophy. Having these 4 distinct categories brilliantly prove that African philosophy isn't just some singular ancient relic. It is a vibrant, modern, wonderfully diverse, and highly debated field of active inquiry. Which naturally brings us to the intense dialectic between Eurocentrism and Afrocentrism. Looking at the textual evidence in our sources, it suggests that both of these frameworks are actually severely flawed. Eurocentrism, for instance, relies on a paternalistic construct that completely lacks a factual historical lineage. But on the flip side, Appiah critiques Afrocentrism as well, arguing that it relies on the exact same biological essentialism and historical myths it's supposedly trying to fight. Both sides, he argues, totally ignore the messy, beautiful realities of human migration, trade, and cultural exchange. So, where does that leave us? How do we move forward? Well, instead of relying on those rigid biological categories, this philosophical perspective proposes a completely different framework. First, we acknowledge the biological fallacy of race. Second, we recognize that culture is totally dynamic and always shifting. And third, we start treating these identities as collective scripts. Drawing on John Stuart Mill, Appia explains that these scripts definitely guide our behavior in society, but they should absolutely never override our individual autonomy. This leads us to a massive question about our place on the global stage, namely, how should we relate to the wider world? Do we isolate ourselves in a sort of parochial nationalism, caring only for our immediate tribe? Or do we go the opposite route and lose all our local flavor and attachments in a completely abstract, borderless universalism?
Appia's brilliant synthesis to that exact dilemma is something he calls rooted cosmopolitanism. He famously wrote that cosmopolitans are partialists who acknowledge special obligations to proximate groups while upholding universal duties to humanity. In plain terms, it's the incredibly liberating idea that you can deeply cherish your local ties, your family, your city, your specific cultural heritage, while still completely honoring your ethical obligations to every other human being on the planet. You don't have to choose. You can and really should do both.
Now, a really crucial tool for any rooted cosmopolitan is this concept of fallibilism. This is simply the understanding that moral progress doesn't come from assuming our own cultural superiority and just forcing it on others. Instead, it comes from mutual understanding, real dialogue, and a genuine openness to revising our own beliefs when we encounter different ways of living. It is all about cross-cultural conversation rather than imposition. To make this idea a bit more concrete, Appia points to historical objects like Guinean Asante gold weights. Now, these objects beautifully embody very specific local aesthetic values. Yet, at the same time, they invite cross-cultural appreciation from anyone, anywhere around the world. They are living proof that local traditions can be universally admired and preserved without ever demanding that the rest of the world conform to a single, uniform standard. This brings us to what might seem like a controversial idea at first: cultural contamination. Appia actually argues that this contamination is a huge virtue. He points out that demanding cultural purity only stifles innovation. In reality, it's historical borrowing, trade, migration, and exchange that are the true engines of human flourishing. When cultures mix and quote-unquote contaminate one another, they adapt, they grow, and they build bridges across seemingly impossible differences. And these liberating ideas haven't just stayed locked away in the ivory tower. Appia's cultural impact has been absolutely massive. From publishing his renowned book Cosmopolitanism in 2006, to receiving the National Humanities Medal in 2010, to writing the ethicist column for the New York Times starting in 2015, all the way to winning the Kluge Prize in 2024, he has profoundly impacted public life, helping everyday people navigate their own moral dilemmas using these exact frameworks. So what is the main takeaway from our explainer today? It's this: politics and society will invariably try to use identities to mobilize us, and unfortunately, sometimes to divide us. But we have to actively ensure that these labels don't strip us of our shared humanity. We absolutely must cultivate inclusive identities that prioritize our shared human commitments over tribal exclusions. Ultimately, since the boundaries of our identities are largely just social illusions, scripts handed down to us that are too often meant to divide, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. If race is an illusion, and you aren't biologically bound to the labels society has given you, how will you choose to rewrite your identity today?